myself situated so I don't have to move around too much here. Okay, and I'm good. May I speak?
Hi, I'm Tim Naftali, Director of the Richard Nixon Presidential Library Museum. Today is August 17, 2007. I'm here with the Reverend Charles Colson.
It's actually just Chuck Colson because I'm not ordained. I'm a layman working full-time in ministry, however.
Well, then it's my pleasure to be with Chuck Colson
Right.
in Naples, Florida.
Lovely place.
Thank you for joining us to participate in the Richard Nixon Presidential Oral History program.
Happy to do it.
I'd like to start in Massachusetts. I'd like to ask you a little bit about your political education working with Leverett Saltonstall.
Well, when I came out of the Marines, I came right to Washington to go to law school nights and met one of the senator's assistants. And so by a remarkable set of circumstances, I ended up at age 25 in the office of United States Senator in the number 2 job in the office, and 2 years later became his administrative assistant. I was certainly on the fast track. I loved politics. I had studied political philosophy at Brown University. That was my undergraduate degree. I was going to law school with an emphasis on constitutional law, so I was fascinated by government. As a kid, I'd handed out leaflets on street corners back home in Massachusetts, and really had a dream that someday I might be able to do something significant in politics, not because at that stage, at least, I thought I was looking for power. I really loved the satisfaction of seeing things done that changed the way people live. And I had a wonderful 5 years working, or 4.5 years working with Leverett Saltonstall. He was a distinguished public servant. He really cared about the common good. He was not partisan. He was very bipartisan in his approach. I was the partisan. My job as his administrative assistant was to get him reelected in 1960. And it was a formidable task. First, I'd never run a political campaign. Secondly, John Kennedy was on the ticket from Massachusetts the same year we were running as Republicans on the other side of the ticket, and the polls showed us way behind. So I started out the campaign having had no experience at it, figuring out what turned out to be some pretty good strategies, and we ended up winning it with an 800,000 vote split between Kennedy and Nixon, between Kennedy and Saltonstall. So that was my introduction to politics. That was a baptism by fire. During that period of time, I got to know Richard Nixon. He was vice president. And I would take things to him periodically, Saltonstall being a senior senator, Nixon being vice president. They would have a lot of occasion to deal with one another. So I had a fair amount of personal face-to-face contact with Nixon. I was dazzled by the man. I found him to be extraordinarily well-motivated, very idealistic, very keen, wonderful mind, uncommon intellect. And we became friends of sorts. I mean, I got acquaintances, I would say, politically. And after I left Senator Saltonstall's office to practice law, I ended up in 1962 in Richard Nixon's, I'm sorry, can I stop that? You're on digital, aren't you?
No, that's okay. Go ahead. Just stop and...
I ended up in 1964 sitting in Richard Nixon's law office in New York, plotting how he might get the nomination that year. So I never really left politics. I was practicing law, but I never really left it.
Let me ask you, before we move to 64, because I know something very interesting happened then, what was a Massachusetts Republican? How would you describe, what was a Massachusetts Republican in that era?
They would tend to be more liberal, middle of the road, certainly than the Orange County crowd, or the then burgeoning conservative movement. Probably burgeoning is the wrong word. It was emerging from Barry Goldwater and the New Guard, as opposed to the old country club Christians, the old country club Republicans, which would be the case for Massachusetts. I was a misfit because I was a bit of an ideologue conservative, having studied Russell Kirk and Edmund Burke in college, and really interested. I really got very involved with Barry Goldwater and with some of the young, at that time, young conservative activists on Capitol Hill. So I was very much at home with the Orange County crowd and very much at home with Richard Nixon, even though I came from that bastion of the liberal elite which Nixon so disdained.
So it's 64, and you write him a memorandum.
I did. I realized Goldwater was going to get the nomination, but I didn't think he could win. I didn't want to see a liberal candidate beat him. I thought Nixon was the one candidate who would have the credentials to debate and possibly beat Lyndon Johnson. And so I wrote him a memorandum in the spring telling him why I thought he should run, why I thought he should step in, why if the convention would have deadlock, he would be the perfect candidate, why he should be maneuvering himself to get in position to run if he could. He invited me to New York. We spent some time together, went up to his apartment one evening. He talked about his vision for foreign policy and his ideas about NATO and the North Atlantic alliances and the emerging alliances in the world, the dangers of communism. It was a fascinating evening. And he said to me, riding in his car, he said, you know, if I get in this campaign to run for president, he said, I just can't face all those same tired pedestrian faces that hung around me in 1960. He said, I need some fresh blood. Would you come in and help run the campaign? And of course I bit at that immediately because I would love to, at that point, would have loved to have worked for Richard Nixon. But I did some surveying, which he asked me to do, of congressmen and political leaders, and got few takers. I think the Goldwater machine had it pretty well locked up. So it was an idea that was fell short. He obviously did not run.
How many of the inner circle shared this optimism that perhaps there could be a brokered convention in '64?
Buchanan was one of them. He was in the Nixon office, the law office, and working with him. I don't think Haldeman and Ehrlichman, at least if they did, I had no contact with them. I don't know. I don't think there were very many.
But so from 1964 on, he sees you as someone he can bat ideas around with.
Yeah, he did not much until '68. When he formed his campaign, which was very successful, to go out and win congressional friends in the '66 election, I was not involved. I got some invitations to be involved, but that was a difficult time. I was building my law practice, and I would have gotten into a presidential campaign, but didn't get into that. So I didn't have that much contact with him until the '68 campaign, when I assisted working through Bryce Harlow and a few others on the campaign that I knew well, Bob Ellsworth, assisted in some of the issue papers. I then ended up taking a leave of absence from my law firm for 4 months and working full-time at it, sharing an office in New York at the headquarters with, of all people, Alan Greenspan, who was doing domestic policy, and Dick Allen.
How confident were you in '68 that he'd be elected?
Not at all. We'd seen what happened in 1960, how easily the lead could evaporate. I crossed swords for the first time, and not the last, in the 1968 campaign with John Mitchell. John Mitchell felt he had a lead and he wanted to sit on it, and I thought that was dumb politics, because momentum is everything in political campaigns. You're either rising or you're falling. You're not sitting still. And I thought it was important that Nixon make a really concerted push. And I particularly saw an opportunity to do what Truman had done so effectively in 1948, and that's put a coalition together of particular interest groups that felt left out by the Democratic Party, and to form what I saw in '68 and then articulated in '70 and '72, this new emerging conservative majority in America. So I got into some squabbles with Mitchell over that. I was a bit on the outside because Mitchell had pretty well cornered Nixon's ear. And so he won that battle, and we went down to the wire, as we all know now, rescued what would have been a lost campaign by Nixon's, I believe, by Nixon's election eve performance with the questions and answers. He was absolutely virtuoso.
You think that's what turned,
Oh,
that's
yeah.
what saved it?
I watched the polls that weekend and saw them vacillate back and forth. I think the big push came on election eve when Nixon did such a superb job.
you had a sense for politics. Was this from your experiences in Massachusetts? Was it from your reading? I mean, you're a young pup then. You're a young pup telling people
Yeah.
what they should be doing.
Right.
Where does this come from?
I was a Marine officer, a captain. In the infantry. I'd always been in charge of things. I'd been editor of the school newspaper when I was in prep school. I got to be championship debater. I was always running things. It just came naturally to me, and I loved politics. I loved the intrigue of it. I loved the way you're mobilizing public opinion. And I was something of a student of it, just from my undergraduate studies and my own personal interest. So I think I had a pretty good nose for it. I'd been hanging around a lot of politicians in Washington, learning a lot. And so when I was in the '68 campaign, I would have been 37 years old. Young, but I had some strong, passionate ideas.
Had you learned anything from watching the Kennedys?
From watching the candidates?
Yeah, Kennedys. From watching
the Kennedys. Oh my, well, yeah. John Kennedy was the junior senator from Massachusetts when Leverett Saltonstall was the senior senator. And it was interesting because Saltonstall called him John, and John Kennedy always called Leverett Saltonstall senator. Most of the time when John Kennedy wanted to deal with Senator Saltonstall, he would call me. I dealt with Kennedy a great deal. Kennedy's staff were all friends of mine. We were buddies, even though we were on opposite sides of the political aisle. And they showed me some of the tricks of the trade. In fact, I learned some things from Ted Reardon, who was one of Kennedy's assistants, about how they'd won their last statewide senatorial election. And I copied some of their good ideas politically. I also organized a major mailing in the 1960 election in Massachusetts of Democrats for Kennedy and Saltonstall. And we mailed that to every Irish name we could read in the phone book. Organized a major mailing. It was, of course, all secret until the last minute, until it was mailed. But it peeled off a lot of Democratic votes. It was obviously not helping Nixon, but Nixon didn't have a chance of carrying Massachusetts. He'd written it off. He'd been there in the campaign. I talked to them, and he knew he didn't have any chance to win it. He thought he could engage Kennedy, but his engagements with Kennedy, whether he's in Massachusetts or anywhere else, were not helping him because Kennedy came off better in the debates, visually, not in terms of content. So, yeah, I learned a lot from the Kennedys. Learned a lot from watching Massachusetts politics.
We're going to talk a lot more about Richard Nixon, but let's spend a minute on John Kennedy. You interacted with him a lot. Just give us a word picture. What was he like?
Well, he was a charming guy. He's a very nice fellow to work with. He was smart in the sense that he knew how to use people effectively and where to get the resources. He was charismatic and could draw the best out of people. He was a good leader. I never thought he had the depth of experience or feeling about the world that Nixon had. And most of his experience had been simply as a senator in Massachusetts, so that was to be expected. I was with him a few times when he was president and watched him, as I've watched every president that I've known, which now goes back to Eisenhower, grow enormously in the job. I mean, Kennedy took on the responsibilities and never had a chance, tragically, to really develop a major thrust to his own presidency, but he certainly grew in that job.
68. You're working on the Key Issues Committee.
Right.
With John Tower, I think.
John Tower was the chairman, and Brad Morse, my pal from Massachusetts, congressman, was the vice chairman, which is how I got involved in it.
What were your thoughts about the Great Society?
Well, I thought it had been a failure in the sense that it was promising something that couldn't be achieved by government, basically. And it was, even in those days, and I've come to believe this more deeply today with good evidence to support it, it was eroding a sense of responsibility among people for handling their own lives. And I've seen that now working the last 30 years in prisons, the fact that criminals today feel like victims. We created a victim mentality in the Great Society. I also was a small government conservative, which meant cut back the size of government, which is one reason I liked Nixon so much. And the Great Society was the precise reverse. It was government taking over all aspects of life. So I was pretty strongly opposed to it.
Richard Nixon wins,
Mm-hmm.
but you don't go into the government immediately.
Well, I had some invitations too. John Volpe became Secretary of Transportation. He was an old friend of mine from Massachusetts politics, had been governor, and we were very close, and he asked me to come in and be general counsel of the Department of Transportation. I refused. He asked me if I'd be undersecretary. I said I would consider it, but I really wasn't very excited about that. And then Elliot Richardson, who was then Assistant Secretary of State, Undersecretary of State. Elliot Richardson, who was Undersecretary of State, called me one day and asked me if I would come over and meet with him. And Elliot and I had worked very closely together in Massachusetts, had a lot of respect for one another. And he asked me if I'd be Assistant Secretary of State for handling the legislative affairs of the State Department. And I got intrigued with that. Ironically, I had been opposed to getting into Vietnam. I thought it was a mistake. I thought we would be in a quagmire. I thought Eisenhower had been right in the late 50s when he said, don't get into a land warfare in Southeast Asia because you can't win it. And so I had written some statements for Jerry Ford when he was Republican leader, saying that we shouldn't rise to the bait. We shouldn't get into Vietnam. Here's Elliot Richardson saying, will you come in and help defend the Vietnam War on the Hill? And I told Elliot I didn't think I could do it as a matter of, I didn't believe in it. He made a very persuasive argument that we should be at least able to give the Vietnamese people a chance to help themselves, live their own lives, and leave honorably. He articulated, this was in the middle of 1969, he articulated the Nixon policy, which Nixon then later spoke about at Guam. And I was impressed by that. I thought, we're in this thing, it's a mess. And Elliot appealed to my better instincts, and I told him I would seriously consider it if Bill Rogers wanted me to do it. Took me in to meet Bill Rogers, and I guess they put my name forward to clear it at the White House for appointment as Assistant Secretary of State. Bryce Harlow would have to clear that name. I got a call from Bryce Harlow, an old friend that worked for Eisenhower, and he said, I understand you're considering going over with the striped pants crowd at the State Department at Foggy Bottom. And I said, yeah, because my old friend Elliot has asked me to do it. He said, you're not going anywhere in government except here, and come over and see me. So I went over to the White House, had some meetings with Bryce. He told me frankly that the old man, as he called him, was feeling strangled by the Berlin Wall, by Haldeman and Ehrlichman. He needed somebody who could break him out of that, get him in touch with the broader world, who knew Washington, who could get him in touch with the power bases in the city of Washington, and help him politically, because he wasn't getting that from Haldeman and Ehrlichman. I'm sure it's hard to talk about this now. That was obviously in great confidence. And he told me that I should write up my own job description of what I thought I could accomplish. The idea being to help Nixon solidify himself politically with interest groups and political centers of power and outside constituencies, which I did. And ended up sitting with Bob Haldeman one night, who went through it all and said he thought that might be a workable thing. He'd let me know. Next thing I knew, I had a call to come over and see Nixon and asked me to come in and be his special counsel, which I did in November of '69.
John Whitaker, let me look at the interview you did with him, and you described in this interview with John Whitaker, you say that when you saw Nixon in '69,
right,
he seemed worn down.
Well, I got there right after the week after a lot of the protests and demonstrations that surrounded the White House, 250,000 people. I also hadn't seen Nixon since the campaign, and except at public events. I mean, I hadn't sat down with him. I'm not sure the first time that I really spent any time with him, it was over the first few months I was in the White House when he called me in for a specific purpose. But he seemed frustrated, and he seemed tired and beleaguered. And you could tell what that first year had done to him. You could also tell what the opposition was doing to him. I mean, and that's what every president discovers, is that you go in and it's a great glamorous moment, and Hail to the Chief is played and music you love to hear. And then all of a sudden you discover all the problems you got to deal with, the bureaucracy that is intractable, the White House staff that doesn't do what you tell them to do, and the press. I mean, Nixon came into a terrible reception in Washington. I remember the Washington Post article by, I think by Sally Quinn, saying the Nixon crowd coming from Orange County to Washington is like Hitler occupying Paris. There was some pretty mean stuff said. There were poor relations right from day one with the Nixon administration. So I saw this in Nixon. I saw the toll it had taken on him.
What were the first issues that you worked with? Did you work on the ABM?
Oh yeah, intimately on the ABM. I guess I was in charge of that campaign in the White House. The first thing that ever happened, I've written about it in my book because it was kind of colorful. Bryce Harlow had said to me, one of these days we are going to see a large mushroom cloud erupt over the Oval Office because the old man is not getting what he wants from his staff. Well, the first time Nixon called me in, it was on a Friday afternoon. I'd just been there a short period of time. And he had Haldeman and Ehrlichman in the office, and he said, Chuck, he said, tell me what you think about these Catholic voters you keep talking about. What should we be doing? So I told him some of the issues that I thought were important to the Catholic constituency, and particularly school aid for parochial schools. There was a case going on in the courts, so there was a debate about whether the government would get involved, whether the administration would get involved. And Nixon looks at Haldeman and Ehrlichman and says, we're going to do this. Bang, hits the desk. I want an executive order. I want the Justice Department into this. I want to get us involved in helping get aid to parochial schools. I believe in that. So he turns to me and points his finger and said, okay, it's Friday afternoon. Have it on my desk Monday morning. And then he said to me, I guess Haldeman and Ehrlichman had just left the room. That's what happened. Haldeman and Ehrlichman had just walked out of there. And he turned to me and he said, you understand what I want to do, don't you? And I said, yes, sir. He said, okay, get me an executive order on my desk Monday morning. I said, yes, sir. And he said, don't pay any attention to Haldeman and Ehrlichman. They're Christian Scientists. They don't understand this. I thought it was humorous. He'd already figured out how their own religious beliefs affected what they were going to do policy-wise. And it did frequently in the White House. And Nixon saw this shrewdly. Anyway, that led to an absolutely explosive weekend when I got Bill Rehnquist, later Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, said he was then the Assistant Attorney General for the Office of Legal Counsel. I said, Bill, I need an executive order here by Monday morning. And he got a hold of Ehrlichman, who was somewhere gone off for a ski weekend or weekend away from the White House. And Ehrlichman said, tell him to forget it. Well, we got it. I wrote parts of it myself, brought it into the president. Of course, there was absolute fury from Haldeman and Ehrlichman. From that day on, I was toxic with them because Nixon would do this frequently. If he couldn't get them to do what he wanted them to do, he would give it to me to do, order me to get it done. I would, and all it did was create a White House of constant friction. He did this with Haldeman and Ehrlichman and me frequently. He did it with me occasionally with Kissinger. So there were always those moments where I was viewed as the loose cannon, and to some extent I was, as far as the White House bureaucracy was concerned, but that was at the direct bidding of the President of the United States. He wanted it that way.
Did he choose to have contestation and friction because it meant better ideas, or did it because
no,
that's how he controlled people?
Both. It was both. his desire to, that was the way he operated. He would love to hear the clash of ideas. He'd love a good debate. He actually, everybody had the idea you should be a yes man to Richard Nixon. That's not true. He liked hearing good arguments if they were well reasoned. And he was very bright. He could get this in a hurry. He also realized that there was a natural process of lethargy that sets into a White House or any bureaucracy, any institution. And that people will kind of do what they feel like doing. They'll do what's urgent, what they have to do. And he was seeing a lot of his good stuff mired down in his own operation. Haldeman's job was to kick everybody's butt and get it done, but Haldeman often wouldn't do that because he was much more wired into the structure. It was his structure. He had created it. So Nixon used me in that way. But I think it was his way of getting things done, but it was also his way of flushing out ideas. He didn't like to make the final decision without listening to everybody's argument. And he would get a position paper and everybody chopped off on it. He'd want to hear the other side of it. In fact, he'd play devil's advocate often with many of us in the White House staff. Some people didn't realize what he was doing, but he was forcing you to flush out the arguments.
Like a lawyer.
Yeah, like a lawyer, exactly, like preparing for a case.
Tell me about what you did on ABM. How did you create support for that?
Well, we created an outside committee, Safeguard America Committee, which was a wonderful play on names. And I raised some money from outside interest groups. To back this committee, we got some prestigious people on it, some former foreign policy experts. And I was put in charge. Haldeman called me in one day and he said, the president wants you to do this, and the president talked to me about it 3 or 4 times. You coordinate everything going on in the White House. So I coordinated the legislative liaison and the public campaign. The public campaign was very significant because we were able, Herb Klein and I flew up one day to visit Henry Cabot Lodge at his home in Beverly, Mass, and got him to write an article. We got the writer, which was published in Reader's Digest on why the Safeguard America campaign, the ABM, was vital to our security, and I was personally deeply convinced it was an essential bargaining chip in the SALT agreement process. Absolutely could not have achieved what was achieved in arms limitation without it. So for me, it was not just a political victory, it was a labor of deep conviction. 3 things proved decisive. The number of gray-haired foreign policy eminences that I was able to recruit to support us, who then went up on Capitol Hill and did some lobbying, number 1. Number 2, a long talk I had with an old friend, but also someone who could be very treacherous at times to be a friend of, because she was personally vindictive, was Margaret Chase Smith. Margaret Chase Smith, I'd known since I came to Washington. She was close to Leverett Saltonstall, and I went back and cashed in every chip I had, making the case to her, and I can honestly say from the discussion that I had with her, which was a long one, that it was the arguments on the merits that switched her vote. Her vote was the critical one we needed and used to win. The other thing that helped a lot was an advertisement that I did for the newspaper. As a funny story to this, but I raised the money to put a full-page ad in the Washington Post, Safeguard America, a sign of and a picture of a huge mushroom cloud from an atomic explosion saying, "Save America from this, Safeguard," and all these distinguished names signing it. That came out the week before the vote and created a huge stir in town. And that very afternoon, I got called in by Nixon. He told me he thought it was the best ad he'd ever seen, and he wrote on his news summary the next morning. He said, "That ad is the best thing I've seen. We need more ad writers like that." Well, I'd done it in my own office. It absolutely, it rankled at Haldeman about as much as anything that ever happened, because Haldeman came from the advertising world. He considered himself an advertising marketing genius. He considered me a political lawyer. And I wrote, so when I got a copy of the news summary with Nixon's marks on it, I sent it back to all of them, and I said, anytime you want this old Washington lawyer writing your ads, let me know. I can work for you at J. Waller Thompson later. But we'd rub it in with each other that way. But that would prove to be a very successful use of outside resources to get a significant foreign policy objective achieved.
We interviewed Mel Laird, and he said he played a role also in getting those votes.
He did. Mel Laird was a very effective lobbyist on the Hill. I would say that there were 2 or 3 others who carried a lot of weight up there. I'll think of the names as we go along. I don't think Bill Rogers did not do much. He was not able to do much. He just didn't have that credibility in that area. But a few people were able to make significant inroads. We started out with behind by several votes.